There is a place on the southwestern edge of Africa where the land has been trying to kill everything that walks across it for millions of years. Not the dramatic sudden killing of a predator or a flood or a fire, something slower and more thorough than that. A killing that works through deprivation, through the withdrawal of the one thing that every living organism on this planet cannot function without. Not even for a matter of days. Water. The land here withholds it, the sky here withholds it, the ground here absorbs it, hides it, locks it away in places that require either ancient knowledge or extraordinary luck to find. And then the sun rises, and the temperature climbs past 40 degrees, and the dry wind comes off the gravel plains, and the land just waits to see what you are made of. This is Namibia. And once you understand what it actually is, once you understand the scale of the dryness and the heat and the distances and the silence and the sheer geological age of the forces that shaped it, you will never again think of it as simply a beautiful place to visit. You will think of it as a test. The oldest, hardest, most patient test on the surface of the earth. Subscribe right now if you want to understand what survival actually means. Not the version from television studio, but the real version, the one that has been playing out in this landscape for tens of thousands of years and is still playing out today. Let us go. To understand Namibia, you have to start with a number. The number is 5, as in the Namib Desert, the great coastal desert that gives this country its name, is approximately 5 million years old. 5 million. For context, our species, Homo sapiens, has existed for somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years. The Namib was already ancient, already fully formed as one of the driest environments on Earth before our ancestors had evolved sufficiently to stand upright and look across a landscape and decide whether to attempt to cross it. This desert is older than us. It was here before us. It will very likely be here after us. And in the meantime, it has been running a continuous experiment in what life looks like when almost everything has been taken away. The annual rainfall in parts of the Namib averages less than 15 millimeters per year. In some zones, it averages less than 5. To understand what that means in practical terms, consider that a single thunderstorm in a temperate climate can deliver more water in an afternoon than some parts of the Namib receive across an entire decade. The desert receives almost no direct rainfall. What water exists, what water has always made life possible here, comes from other sources entirely, from the cold Benguela current that flows northward up the Atlantic coast, generating the coastal fog that rolls inland from the ocean in the early morning hours before the sun burns it off. Fog, not rain. Fog is the primary water source for an entire desert ecosystem spanning more than 80,000 square kilometers. Think about what it means to build a survival strategy around fog. The fog does not fall. It cannot be caught in a vessel in the conventional sense. It exists as suspended moisture in the air, billions of tiny water droplets too small to be individual rain, drifting inland off the cold ocean surface and then warming as it moves away from the coast and evaporating before it can become anything you could drink. And yet life here has found a way to use it, has spent millions of years evolving mechanisms to extract water from air that contains almost none. The solutions that natural selection has arrived at in the Namib are so creative, so elegant, so unexpected, that engineers and designers and architects around the world study them as models for solving problems of water scarcity in the modern era. Ancient organisms in an ancient desert figured out, over millions of years of ruthless selection, what we are still trying to figure out in our laboratories. The Namib desert beetle, Stenocara gracilipes, is perhaps the most studied example. It is a small, dark insect, unremarkable to look at, the kind of thing you might step past without noticing. But its back is one of the most sophisticated water collection surfaces in the natural world. The beetle's back is covered in a pattern of tiny bumps, each bump hydrophilic at its tip, meaning it attracts and holds water, and hydrophobic on its slopes and the surface between bumps, meaning water runs off it rather than spreading across it. When the morning fog rolls in off the Atlantic, the beetle climbs to the top of a dune ridge, tilts its body forward at an angle of about 45 degrees, and waits. The fog droplets collect on the hydrophilic tips of the bumps. They accumulate. They grow until they are large enough that their own weight overcomes the surface tension holding them to the bump. Then they roll off the bump, down the hydrophobic slopes, and run down the tilted surface of the beetle's back directly to its mouth. The beetle is drinking fog. It engineered a fog-drinking body, and it has been doing this for millions of years in a place where almost nothing else drinks anything at all. This principle, fog collection using surfaces that alternate between water-attracting and water-repelling textures at a micro scale, has now been incorporated into experimental water collection materials designed to harvest drinking water from fog in arid regions around the world. The beetle figured it out first. The beetle has been using it longer than our civilization has existed. When we talk about survival knowledge in the Namib, we need to understand that the accumulated survival knowledge of this desert goes so far back and runs so deep that the organisms that carry it are themselves among the most ancient things alive. The humans who have learned to survive here are the newcomers. They are working from a knowledge base that is perhaps 30 or 40,000 years old. The beetles are working from one that is millions of years old, but let us talk about the humans. Because the human story of survival in Namibia is itself extraordinary, and it is a story that most of the world does not know in any real depth. The San people, who have been called Bushmen, a name with a complicated and not always respectful history, though it is increasingly reclaimed and used with pride by some communities, are the oldest continuously resident human population in southern Africa. Genetic evidence suggests that their lineage diverged from other human populations more than 100,000 years ago, making them among the oldest genetically distinct human groups on Earth. They have been living in the driest, hottest, most demanding landscapes of southern Africa for an almost incomprehensible span of time. The Namib and the Kalahari, the two great desert systems that define much of the landscape of Namibia and Botswana and neighboring countries, are not environments they were pushed into by circumstance or by more powerful groups, though that also happened, historically. These are environments they know with a depth and an intimacy that is the product of an unbroken relationship spanning more generations than most. Human civilizations have even existed. The knowledge of water in this landscape is perhaps the most critical and most astonishing dimension of survival practice. Because water does not announce itself here. It does not sit in visible rivers or lakes. It hides. It goes underground. It locks itself inside plants. It concentrates in microscopic quantities in places that look, to an untrained eye, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Finding water in the Namib and Kalahari is a skill so complex and so hard won that it cannot be reduced to a technique or a trick. It is a comprehensive understanding of an entire landscape, built from decades of direct experience and from the accumulated observations of hundreds of generations before. The Sama melon grows in the drier parts of the Kalahari and the Namib margins, a wild relative of the watermelon, scattered across the desert in places that can look completely barren to an outsider. The fruit is bitter, not the sweet flesh of a cultivated watermelon, but it contains water, substantial water. Enough water that sand hunters on extended tracking journeys in the dry season have relied on it not merely as supplementary hydration, but as their primary water source across journeys of many days, covering distances that seem impossible to cover without drinking from any conventional water source. The knowledge of where the Sama grows, in which specific low-lying areas where slightly more moisture collects, in which patches of sandy soil where the roots can tap into a slightly higher water table, in which directions from a given starting point in a landscape that to an outsider looks featureless and indistinguishable from every other direction, this knowledge is not written down anywhere. It lives in the minds of the people who carry it, passed from tracker to apprentice, elder to grandchild, embedded in the landscape knowledge of a community that has had 30,000 years to observe and record in the only medium that was available to them, the human memory. The bivalve, also called the biplant, or in various San languages by names that reflect its central importance to desert survival, is another water storage plant that has sustained sand communities through the worst droughts the Kalahari and Namib margins have delivered. It is an unassuming plant. Its surface growth is modest. What matters is underground, where a large tuber, sometimes as big as a watermelon in mature specimens, stores water through the dry season. The tuber contains enough liquid that sand hunters have traditionally grated it or squeezed it or eaten it directly to extract the moisture. But knowing where the bai grows, recognizing the specific subtle surface signs of its presence in a landscape of mostly featureless sand and sparse vegetation requires the same kind of deep accumulated knowledge as finding the Sama. It is not something you figure out by observation over a few days or weeks. It is something you inherit from people who inherited it, from people who inherited it, from people whose names and faces and individual lives are long gone, but whose knowledge persists in the continuing practice of desert survival. The sip wells are perhaps the most technically demanding water-finding method in the sand toolkit. In certain areas of the desert, particularly in drainages and low ground where water occasionally flows after rare rains and then disappears underground, it is possible to find water in the sand at a depth of a meter or two just below the surface, where the porous sand has retained moisture that evaporated from the top layer. The technique involves pushing a hollow reed down into the wet sand at exactly the right location, then creating a strong suction, drawing the water up through the reed into a closed container, sometimes a sealed ostrich shell, that holds the water collected over minutes or hours of patient extraction. This is not drinking from a stream. This is not filling a bottle from a pool. This is extracting moisture from sand, slowly, one careful sip at a time, from a location that had to be found in the first place using knowledge and observation that most people on Earth do not possess and could not acquire quickly. An ostrich egg holds roughly 1.5 liters of water when used as a storage vessel. In the landscape of the Namib and Kalahari, where the difference between life and death is sometimes measured in a few hundred milliliters of water, a full ostrich egg is significant wealth. Sand communities traditionally cached water in sealed ostrich eggs buried at specific locations across their territories, creating a distributed water storage system that extended their range and their margin of safety in a landscape where margin of safety can evaporate as quickly as water in the midday heat. The locations of those caches were held in memory, encoded in the landscape knowledge of the community, another layer of the invisible infrastructure of survival that kept people alive in places that should not be able to sustain human life. The temperature. We cannot talk about Namibia without really confronting the temperature, because the heat here is not merely uncomfortable. It is physiologically threatening in a way that most people in temperate climates have never directly experienced and therefore underestimate. The human body is a water-dependent cooling system. We sweat to regulate our temperature, and sweating works by evaporation, the same physics that drives the fog collection of the Namib beetle, but in reverse, we are losing water to cool ourselves rather than gaining it from the air. In extreme heat, an active adult human can lose between 1 and 2 liters of water per hour through sweat. In the direct sun of the Namib in summer, with ground temperatures that can reach 70 or 80 degrees even when air temperature is in the 40s, the rate of water loss from the body can be catastrophic if water intake does not keep pace. Dehydration progresses quickly, and it is not always obvious that it is happening until it has already become dangerous. A loss of 2% of body weight as water impairs cognitive function, the ability to think clearly, to make decisions, to navigate. A loss of 5% produces dizziness, headache, severe muscle cramping. A loss of 10% can cause organ failure and death. In the heat of the Namib, in the absence of shade and water, a healthy adult can move from functional to critically dehydrated within a matter of hours, not days, hours. This is the landscape that sand communities have lived in for tens of thousands of years. This is the environment that shaped the survival knowledge they developed and refined across those thousands of years. Every technique, every piece of plant knowledge, every water-finding skill, every behavioral adaptation exists because in its absence people died, and the ones who survived were the ones who knew what they knew and passed it on. The behavioral adaptations are as important as the technical ones, perhaps more so. The decision not to move during the midday hours when the sun is at its height and the temperature is at its peak is not a passive or lazy choice. It is a physiological calculation. Moving in peak heat burns energy and generates body heat and accelerates sweat loss. Sitting still in whatever shade is available reduces all 3 of those variables simultaneously. Sand hunters and trackers traditionally move in the early morning hours when the temperature is lower and the light is adequate for tracking, rest during the brutal midday heat, and move again in the late afternoon as the temperature begins to drop. This rhythm, this calibration of activity to the temperature cycle of the desert day, is so deeply embedded in desert survival practice that it operates almost automatically for people who grew up with it. For outsiders who do not know this rhythm, who keep moving through the midday heat because they feel they need to cover distance, the consequences can be rapid and severe. The tracking. We have to talk about the tracking because sand tracking in the Namib landscape is one of the most extraordinary human cognitive achievements that I am aware of. And it is an achievement that exists almost entirely outside the global recognition it deserves, because it is not the kind of achievement that gets celebrated in the context where global recognition is distributed. It is not a technology. It is not a product. It does not exist in a form that can be easily transmitted through schools or books or the internet. It exists in the perceptual capacity of individual human beings who have spent years developing it, and it exists in the landscape they read it in. A skilled sand tracker can read information from the ground that is, from the perspective of someone who has not developed that perception, simply invisible. A footprint in sand can tell a tracker not just what species made it, but roughly how large the individual was, how fast it was moving when it made the track, how long ago the track was made, whether the animal was injured, which direction it was heading, and what behavioral state it was in when it passed this spot. The moisture level of the soil at the bottom of the track, the way the sand grains at the edges have moved or dried since the print was made, the depth of the impression relative to the known weight of that species, the tiny details of how the claws or hooves contacted the ground surface, all of these are data points that a skilled tracker reads in seconds, synthesizes into an assessment, and acts on. But the more remarkable dimension of tracking is not the reading of individual prints. It is the construction of a narrative across distance and time. A tracker following an animal, perhaps a gemsbok or an eland across the Namib gravel plains, is not simply following footprints from print to print. The tracker is constructing a model of the animal's behavior, its intentions, its likely route based on its behavioral state and the terrain ahead, and using that model to project forward, to move ahead of where the track currently leads to intercept the animal where the model predicts it will be. This requires not just tracking skill in the narrow sense, but a deep knowledge of animal behavior, of the specific terrain, of how different species use the landscape in different conditions, of where water and shade and food are likely to be found in the direction the animal is heading. It requires holding a complex dynamic mental model of the landscape and the animal simultaneously and updating it continuously as new information arrives. This is cognitive performance of the highest order, not in the sense of IQ test performance or academic performance, but in the sense of real-world problem solving under conditions of high stakes and incomplete information. And it is performed by people who are simultaneously managing their own physiological state in extreme heat, rationing their water, navigating terrain that most outsiders could not cross without getting lost, and maintaining the sustained focused attention across many hours that skilled tracking requires. The sand tracker running down a gemsbok across the Namib in midsummer is doing something cognitively and physically demanding enough that it would be remarkable in any environment. In this environment, with these temperatures and these distances and this level of water scarcity, it is close to superhuman. The persistence hunt is the most extreme expression of this capacity. And it is one of the things about sand hunting that is genuinely difficult for people from outside this tradition to fully believe until they understand the physiology behind it. The persistence hunt is exactly what it sounds like. A hunter locates a target animal, typically a large antelope, and begins running after it. Not sprinting, not chasing in short bursts, but running at a pace that the animal can comfortably outrun in the short term, but that the hunter can maintain far longer than the animal can. Because here is the key physiological fact. Humans are, over long distances in high heat, faster than most large African mammals. Not because we are faster runners, we are absolutely not. The gemsbok or the kudu that is running from a hunter can reach speeds of 60 or 70 kilometers per hour. No human comes close to that. But those animals cool themselves through panting, which is an inefficient cooling system at sustained high effort levels, and they do not sweat the way humans do. In prolonged exertion in high heat, the large antelope overheats before the human does. If the hunter keeps the animal moving, does not let it stop and rest and cool down, the animal will eventually reach a state of heat exhaustion and stop, no longer able to continue, and at that point the hunter catches it. A persistence hunt in the Namib can cover distances of 20 to 30 kilometers or more. It can last anywhere from 2 to 5 hours. The hunter is running in midday heat across terrain that offers almost no shade. The hunter is navigating by the tracks in the terrain, staying on the track even when it crosses hard ground that holds no prints, finding it again on the far side. The hunter is managing their own hydration, which in a traditional pre-modern context means using every water source and every moisture-containing food source they can find along the route, because without careful hydration management during a persistence hunt, the hunter collapses before the animal does. This is running a long race in an oven with your survival and the survival of anyone depending on you, depending on the outcome. Let us step back from the humans and story for a moment and look at the landscape itself, because the Namib is not one thing. It is a collection of different environments that each present their own survival challenges and their own survival solutions, and the variety within this single desert system is extraordinary. The Dune Sea. When most people picture the Namib, they picture the Dune Sea of Sossusvlei, the great central dune field where the sand dunes rise to heights of 300 and 400 meters, among the tallest sand dunes on Earth, in colors that shift through the day from pale gold in the early morning to deep amber and rust red at midday, to the deep orange and purple shadows of late afternoon. These colors are real. They are not enhanced or filtered. They are the result of the age of the sand, which is extremely old, sand from the mountains of southern Africa that was carried down rivers to the coast over millions of years, then blown inland by the prevailing winds, then slowly oxidized over enormous spans of time, the iron in the sand grains rusting to produce the deep red and orange tones that make the Namib Dune Sea look, in photographs, like a landscape from another planet. The Dune Sea is beautiful, and it is also deeply hostile to survival. The sand itself amplifies the heat, absorbing solar radiation during the day and releasing it at night in a way that makes the temperature swing between the extremes even more dramatic than on the gravel plains. Walking on steep, loose sand is exhausting, requiring significantly more energy expenditure per kilometer than walking on hard ground. There is no surface water in the Dune Sea. The only water available is the fog-collected moisture at the bases of dune slip faces in the early morning before the sun warms it away, and the moisture held in specific plants whose roots have gone deep enough to find the remnants of the last rainfall event, which may have been months or years ago. The organisms that live in the Dune Sea are, without exception, masterpieces of extreme adaptation. The sidewinding adder moves across the loose sand in a lateral motion that minimizes contact with the hot surface and maximizes propulsion across an unstable substrate. The shovel-snouted lizard, Marolles anchitae, performs a thermal dance on the hot sand surface, lifting alternating pairs of feet off the burning ground to let them cool, then switching, in a motion that looks almost comical until you understand it is a precise thermal management behavior that the lizard performs dozens of times per minute during the hottest part of the day, doing rapid push-ups on the sand to lift its body away from the surface heat, and then retreating into the sand itself when even the dance cannot manage the heat, diving into the cooler substrate below the scorching surface layer and effectively disappearing from the thermal hell above. The web-footed gecko, Pachydaktylus rangae, emerges from its burrow after dark when the dune temperature has dropped enough to make movement possible, and navigates to the dune ridges where the fog condenses in the early morning hours before dawn. When the fog arrives, the gecko licks the moisture from its own eyes, from the sand around it, gathering enough water to see it through the following day underground. It is the gecko equivalent of the beetle fog collection strategy, a different morphology, a different mechanism, but the same fundamental principle of extracting survival from an atmosphere that provides almost nothing. The Namibia Nature Reserve and the broader Namib National Park together protect an area larger than Switzerland. This is not a small corner of wildness. This is a functioning ancient desert ecosystem of enormous scale, containing within it the full range of Namib environments from the fog belt coast through the gravel plains and the Inselbergs, the isolated granite mountains that rise from the flat plains like islands from a sea, to the dune sea and the seasonal rivers that cross it, and the pan systems where the last surface water in the desert collects and then slowly disappears, the seasonal rivers. This is something that most people who have not been to Namibia do not fully grasp. The rivers here are not permanent. The major rivers of Namibia, the rivers that show up on maps with names and blue lines, do not flow for most of the year. They are dry, they are riverbeds, broad sandy channels that look, for 10 or 11 months of the year, like elongated sandy flats, distinguishable from the surrounding landscape mainly by the trees that grow along their banks, nourished by the deep water table beneath the sand that the river replenishes when it does flow. The ephemeral rivers of Namibia are, for most of their length and most of the year, underground rivers. The water table in the sandy riverbed sits meters below the surface, invisible and inaccessible to most things, but reachable by the long roots of camelthorn acacias and other riparian trees that can tap it from the surface above. Elephants know this. The desert-adapted elephants of the Kunene region in northwestern Namibia, which have evolved or developed behavioral adaptations to the extreme aridity of their range that distinguish them from elephants elsewhere in Africa, are capable of digging into dry riverbeds with their feet and trunks to reach the water table below. They excavate holes in the dry riverbed sand, sometimes going down a meter or more, until the bottom of the hole begins to collect seepage from the surrounding saturated sand. Then they drink from the hole. Then other animals come and drink from the hole after the elephants move on. The elephants are not just surviving for themselves. They are creating water access points for the entire ecosystem, punching through the sand surface to the hidden water below, and in doing so making that water accessible to animals that cannot dig. A dry riverbed with elephant-dug wells in it is a different ecological proposition than a dry riverbed without them. The oryx, the gemsbok, one of the supreme surviving machines of the Namib and Kalahari, can survive in conditions of extreme heat and extreme water scarcity that kill most other large mammals. It does this through a physiological mechanism that was once considered impossible, or at least extraordinary, in a mammal. The gemsbok allows its body temperature to rise, where most mammals, including humans, maintain core body temperature within a very narrow range and suffer organ damage if that temperature rises significantly. The gemsbok's body temperature can increase by several degrees during the hottest part of the day, essentially storing the heat that it absorbs from the sun rather than spending water to sweat it away. Then at night, when the temperature drops, the stored heat is radiated away passively without any water cost. It is a different solution to the same problem that the beetle's back solves, a biological thermal buffering strategy, and it allows the gemsbok to survive in places and conditions where its water needs would otherwise be impossible to meet. The brain is the most temperature-sensitive organ. You cannot allow the brain to overheat even while you are allowing the body to store heat during the day, because the brain will be damaged before the body temperature reaches the level at which the heat storage strategy operates. The gemsbok solves this through a mechanism called countercurrent heat exchange in the blood supply to the brain. The blood going to the brain passes through a network of fine vessels called the carotid rete, where it runs in close proximity to venous blood returning from the nasal passages. The nasal passages cool the venous blood through evaporation of moisture from the nasal surfaces. This cooled venous blood then exchanges heat with the arterial blood heading to the brain, cooling it selectively before it reaches the brain, so that while the body temperature rises, the brain temperature stays lower. So selective brain cooling. The gemsbok keeps its brain at a safe temperature while letting the rest of its body absorb the heat of the desert day. This is engineering. This is extraordinary, precise, elegant engineering that natural selection arrived at over millions of years of surviving in the Namib. The Sand People knew about the gemsbok's heat tolerance long before Western science understood the physiology behind it. They knew that the gemsbok was one of the animals best suited to long pursuit in high heat because they had hunted it that way for thousands of years. They knew which animals exhausted first and which could be run down and which could not. They knew the landscape of heat and physiology the way they knew the landscape of sand and rock by direct long experience, accumulated across generations, tested against the reality of survival every single day. Let us go to the Kaukaveld. If there is a place in Namibia that captures the combination of extreme environment and extraordinary human adaptation in the most direct way possible, it is the Kaukaveld, the remote northwestern region of the country bounded by the Kunene River to the north, the Skeleton Coast to the west, and the increasingly inhabited Central Plateau to the east. The Kaukaveld is one of the most sparsely populated areas of one of the most sparsely populated countries on Earth. The terrain is an extraordinary mix of rugged mountains, dry riverbeds, gravel plains, and isolated springs, some of them the only permanent water sources for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. The Himba people live here. They have lived here, or in the closely related landscapes of northern Namibia and southern Angola for centuries. They are a semi-nomadic pastoralist people, meaning their survival strategy has always revolved around the movement of cattle and goats across a landscape where grazing is available only seasonally and water sources shift with the rains, and where remaining in one place long enough to exhaust the local resources is a survival error that the landscape will punish severely. The Himba are immediately recognizable because of a practice that has attracted enormous outside attention and a great deal of superficial commentary. They cover their skin and hair in a mixture called achais, made from butterfat and ochre powder, and in some preparations aromatic resin from the omazumba shrub. The color is a deep red orange, beautiful and distinctive, and the coverage is comprehensive: skin, hair, and clothing of ochre-dyed fabric, all working together to create a visual unity that is frankly one of the most striking human appearances on Earth. The practice has been written about and photographed and discussed by outsiders primarily as an aesthetic or cultural curiosity. But the functional dimensions of achais are real and significant. In the extreme UV environment of the Caucavelde, where the sun is intense and the landscape offers limited shade, the ochre in the mixture provides a degree of UV protection. The fat component moisturizes skin in a climate of extremely low humidity where dry skin can crack and become vulnerable to infection. In a landscape where water is too scarce to use for bathing in the conventional sense, achais performs a hygiene function, the fat and resin trapping and binding dirt and dead skin cells, which are then scraped off and the mixture reapplied, a dry cleaning system for the skin that works without water. The aromatic resin has antimicrobial properties. The whole system is a response to the specific demands of survival in an environment where water cannot be spent on anything but drinking and cooking. The Himba relationship to water is as fundamental and as carefully managed as anything we have discussed about sand practice. The locations of springs and water holes in the Caucavelde are knowledge that is held at the community level, tracked and updated through the network of social relationships that connects Himba communities across the landscape. When a spring dries up, which springs do in drought years, the community needs to know quickly and the information needs to travel. When a new water source is found, or when an old one recovers after rains, that information also needs to travel. The social network of the Himba is, among other things, a water information network, a distributed system for tracking the location and status of a resource that is simultaneously scarce, mobile in a sense because springs dry up and rain-filled pans form and disappear, and absolutely non-negotiable for survival. The cattle are not separate from the survival strategy. They are integral to it. Cattle in the Caucavelde serve as walking water and food storage. A healthy cow contains a significant volume of water in its blood and tissues and gut contents. In extreme scarcity, cattle provide a source of blood and fluid that can be accessed without killing the animal, a practice known across many pastoralist cultures of arid Africa. The management of cattle in the Caucavelde, knowing when to move them, where to move them, how many to keep, and how many to sell or slaughter based on the available grazing and water, is a complex livestock management skill that is calibrated to the specific carrying capacity of a specific and highly variable landscape. Getting it wrong, keeping too many cattle in a drought year, moving them in the wrong direction, failing to read the early signs of a grazing collapse before it fully develops, can mean the death of the herd. The death of the herd in the Caucavelde is not a financial problem. It is a survival crisis. The Herero, closely related culturally and linguistically to the Himba, occupy a broader range of Namibia and have a historical relationship with this landscape that is inseparable from one of the most devastating events in African colonial history. In the early years of the 20th century, between 1904 and 1908, the German colonial administration conducted what historians now widely recognize as the first genocide of the 20th century against the Herero and Nama peoples of what was then German Southwest Africa. The Herero uprising against German colonial rule, driven in large part by the systematic dispossession of Herero land and cattle and the violence of the colonial administration, was met with a campaign of extermination. The German commander Lothar von Trotha issued a Vernichtungsbefehl, an extermination order, stating explicitly that every Herero, armed or unarmed, would be killed. Those who were not killed directly were driven into the Omahika Desert, the western extension of the Kalahari, and the waterholes were poisoned or guarded to prevent them from drinking. The Omahik, a desert, used as a killing ground, the water withheld. The same landscape that sand communities had survived in for tens of thousands of years using generations of accumulated water knowledge was used as a death trap for a people being driven through it at gunpoint, denied the time to find water, denied the knowledge of where water was in this particular stretch of desert, dying in the sand of dehydration and starvation in numbers that are still debated by historians, but certainly ran to tens of thousands of people. The desert that was a home to those who knew it became a mass grave for those who were forced into it without the knowledge to survive it. This history is not separate from the survival story of Namibia. It is part of it. The knowledge of how to survive in this landscape, the knowledge that the sand carried for tens of thousands of years and the Himba and Herero and Nama built over centuries of pastoralist adaptation, is not just an intellectual or cultural heritage. It is a life or death heritage. It is knowledge that has, across the length of human habitation in this landscape, been the difference between living and dying. And in the early years of the 20th century, the deliberate destruction of a people in a desert was made possible in part by the fact that knowledge cannot be transferred in moments of emergency. You cannot learn desert survival under fire. You cannot learn it under a gun. You cannot learn it in an hour or a day or a week. It takes the kind of time that genocide specifically denies. The Skeleton Coast. I want to take you there now because it is the western edge of everything we have been talking about, the place where the Namib meets the Atlantic, and it is one of the most dramatically named and accurately named places on the planet. The Skeleton Coast runs along the northwestern coast of Namibia for roughly 500 kilometers, and the name comes from two sources simultaneously: the bones of whales and other marine creatures that washed ashore over centuries of maritime activity along this coast, and the bones of human sailors whose ships broke up on the rocks and sandbars and who, even if they survived the wreck and reached the shore, found themselves on the edge of one of the driest and most remote places on Earth with no realistic possibility of walking out. The cold Benguela Current, which is responsible for the fog that provides the Namib's primary moisture source, is also responsible for the extremely dangerous sea conditions along this coast. The upwelling of cold water from the deep ocean creates persistent fog offshore, reducing visibility to near zero for ships navigating close to the coast. The combination of fog, strong southerly winds, powerful surf, and a coastline studded with rocks and sandbars made this stretch of Atlantic one of the most dangerous ship graveyards in the world, from the era of early European exploration of the African coast through the age of sail and well into the modern era. The wrecks are still there, some of them rusting on the beach or just offshore, the most recent ones from the 20th century still clearly identifiable as ships. The older ones reduced to scattered metal and wood, being swallowed by the sand at the rate of a few centimeters per year. The sailors who reached the shore alive after a wreck were in a landscape that they had essentially no tools to survive in. No knowledge of where water was, no knowledge of the plants, no knowledge of the fog collection techniques that the organisms of the Namib had spent millions of years developing, no understanding of the thermal rhythms of the desert day and when to move and when to stop. No network of cached water sources across the landscape, nothing. They were, in the most precise possible sense, completely without the specific knowledge that survival in this landscape requires. Most of them died within days of dehydration more than anything else, close enough to the cold Atlantic that they could hear the surf that had wrecked them, on a coast where the moisture in the air was tantalizingly present in the form of fog that rolled in every morning and then disappeared without providing a drop of water they could drink. There is a particular cruelty in that. Not the cruelty of intention, the landscape has no intentions, but the cruelty of design. Moisture everywhere in the air, none of it drinkable. None of it collectible without tools and knowledge and time that shipwrecked sailors did not have. The San and other indigenous communities of this coastal region did know how to collect fog water. They had been doing it for generations in exactly this landscape. The beetles they could observe doing it every morning gave the basic principle. The specific implementations that humans developed, surfaces made of local materials arranged in specific orientations that maximized collection, containers positioned to catch the runoff, knowledge of which topographic positions in the dune landscape collected the most fog condensation. This knowledge was developed over the same time scale as everything else about desert survival here, over a very long time, by people who had no other option. The brown hyena is one of the Skeleton Coast's apex scavengers, and it has a relationship with this coast that reflects the strange productivity of apparent sterility. The cold Benguela Current, while it creates the fog and the dangerous maritime conditions and the general aridity of the Namib coast, also upwells an extraordinary concentration of nutrients from the deep ocean, making the waters off the Skeleton Coast among the most productive fishing grounds in the world. That marine productivity washes ashore constantly in the form of dead fish, stranded seals, washed-up whale carcasses, the debris of a rich ocean ecosystem. The brown hyena, ranging across the Skeleton Coast and the adjacent desert, has tuned its behavior to exploit this coastal bounty, walking extraordinary